Those who live by the crystal ball will die eating shattered glass. In other words, stop trying to predict the future, build a flexible plan, build one that can be responsive to feedback. You have to build plans that can bend before they break. That is the name of the game.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Alex Ostberg, writer of The Rundown by The Running Effect, back today on the podcast to break down the last 4 editions of The Rundown. If you don't know, that's our state-of-the-art newsletter that we drop every Thursday. I've left a link in the show notes if you haven't heard of it or you want to check it out or you've heard me speak about it multiple times and this is the day you're actually going to take action. Click on it and subscribe and start to get better every single Thursday from your email inbox. Today's conversation, we break down the last 4 editions, which include deep insights on how to become better as a runner. We dive into cognitive traps, the 3 biggest that runners fall into. We talk about how to expect the unexpected and actually get better as a result, be a better reactor and be a better responder. We dive into how to make your bad days better and how to become a better runner as a result of how you respond to bad days, hardships, adversity, etc. We also dive into the myth of predictable progress and some deep, tangible takeaways that if you're a coach, you can implement into your athlete's training, or if you're an athlete, you can better understand your training and how to go about properly predicting progress. This one is packed with training insights, life insights. I hope you guys enjoy it. Pass it around. That's the easiest way in which we can grow is through word of mouth marketing. Give us a 5-star review. It takes 5 seconds to do so. Hit the follow or subscribe button so you don't miss more episodes like this in the future. And lastly, I said it in the beginning, I'll say it again, subscribe to the newsletter. What's the risk? You don't like it, you unsubscribe. No big deal. Please do so. First link in the show notes. Without further ado, enjoy this conversation with the man of the hour, Alex Ostberg. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back breaking down the best insights from The Rundown by The Running Effect, written by the man across from me, Alex Ostberg. Just a quick note, I'm sure I said this in the intro, but if you haven't already checked it out, please do so. It's completely free to subscribe. It's even more free to go on the website and check it out before subscribing, but I'm confident you'll find a lot of value if you check out the editions. And the beauty of a free product is you can subscribe, get 1 edition on Thursday, and if you don't like it, you can always unsubscribe. I promise you that will not be the case. Anyways, all that being said, Alex, how you doing? Back from Tokyo, is the jet lag worn off?
Yeah, it's been more than a week now. It was harder coming this way back to the United States from Japan than it was to get used to the time zone out there. So it probably has something to do with circadian rhythm and biology, but yeah, flying across the Pacific was a little more gentle on my sleep schedule than coming back. It was a bit more abrupt, but yeah, I had a long journey back from Kyoto to Tokyo to Salt Lake City, and then I had to drive my car from Salt Lake City back to Eugene, Oregon, because that's where I kept my car over the summer for altitude camp. So for the first time in about 4 months, I'm not living out of a suitcase, which is nice, to say the least.
I love it. There's this great line. I'm not a big fan of his music, but there's this rapper Logic, and he's got this excellent line in a song of his. I think the song is named Run It. And he says, I never knew that living in a dream meant living out of a suitcase, something like that. Basically, like living the dream meant living out of a suitcase. And sometimes I relate to that because I'm like, yeah, a lot of the opportunities that I felt like were dreams growing up do require living out of a suitcase, constantly going from thing to thing.
It's true. So it was a pretty awesome summer, and I'm very privileged to get to do the things that I can. But certainly nice to be back in the routine. And yeah, I mean, related to this podcast, I feel like we're hitting the stride with the newsletter. I think we have 24 or so published issues and more on the way. So it's been really fun to engage with the audience and keep wrestling with some of these ideas that we're bringing out into the public light. So it's been fun.
First one to break down today is the 3 cognitive traps that break runners and how to avoid them. Mindset is obviously such a pillar in not just life, but in our sport. I think it can dictate a lot of success or failure. Take the people through. What are these 3 cognitive traps and how do you overcome them?
Yeah, so just to back up for a second to introduce the topic, I think there's probably a difference between mindsets, which you kind of actively shape, and then there's a difference between that and cognitive biases, which are basically like preloaded errors in our cognitive machinery that tend to lead us in the wrong direction. And they all exist for a reason, but they tend to steer us into predictable traps. And one of my favorite things, as we've discussed many times on the podcast, is finding interdisciplinary connections. And the ability to connect running with psychology is one of my favorite things because I studied it in school. And obviously I'm now a student, I guess, of the sport as well. And so there's this great quote I refer to often from Richard Feynman, who said the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. And I found that being in the sport for long enough, that we tend to make very, very common mistakes, but a lot of times our sample size is not large enough, and we're not objective enough to see them. In other words, if an athlete just looks at their own career, they're only looking at like a handful of mistakes in a few years. And so it's really hard to identify this input led to this output. And so that feedback loop is really noisy. It's kind of hard to discern what's going on. But one major shift that I've noticed as a coach is that when you start to work with athletes and you're seeing it objectively from the outside's perspective, and you're getting a larger sample size of mistakes to draw from, you're like, there's some commonalities here that I'm starting to see. So I think that a lot of the mistakes we make, they rhyme, even if the scenarios differ. And it's really hard to out-muscle our blind spots. But I think we can think about the world in a slightly different way and at least be aware of these things so that when we are kind of barreling towards some of these inevitable traps, we can catch ourselves early. So that's kind of, and if we could learn from other people's mistakes too, that would help us even more. So we can kind of go through the three of them, if that's what you want to do next.
I want to break down one specific part that I found fascinating. Everybody thinks they're above average. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm talking about something called the planning fallacy, which is where we consistently underestimate how long something will take or how much something will cost, even if we've done it before. There are so many studies out there that prove this point, but I found a couple of examples that I found particularly entertaining. So only 2% of high school seniors believe their leadership skills are below average. Obviously, the math doesn't add up. 94% of college professors report they're above average in teaching ability. 25% of students believe they're in the top 1% of their ability to get along with others. And college students, I love this one, do a superior job of predicting the longevity of their roommate's romantic relationship relative to their own. So it just goes to show, like, cutting across multiple different demographics and ages in life, like, we always think we're better than we are. And it's very, very hard to objectively evaluate ourselves. We're the worst observers of ourselves, I write. And so one thing that's really helpful to do here is to do something, which is to take the outside view, which is something that, like, a lot of psychologists would recommend. We have to recognize that we have this inherent bias to be overly optimistic with timelines. If anybody here is listening has ever had like a home renovation project, or they're setting a budget for something, like, go back and look and hold yourself accountable. What was your original estimate, and how long did it take, or how much did it cost? You're always going to exceed it, almost always going to exceed it. It's extremely rare to be faster than the timeline or under budget. The way I see this pop up in running is that a lot of times people will get like a diagnosis from a doctor, and they say, hey, you need X number of weeks to recover. And I think there's a difference between like cautious optimism and like extreme optimism, because I think a lot of times we tell people, hey, it's really great to be extremely optimistic. And I think it feels motivating in the moment, but it often sets us up for heartbreak, because when that reality lags behind expectation, you're kind of in trouble, right? And it's better to anchor your perspective in realistic parameters and be pleasantly surprised when that progress comes faster than you'd expect. So again, take the outside perspective and say, okay, in similar cases with other people, what have the averages been? And let me try to nudge that forward a little bit rather than completely rewriting the timeline, because you just cannot bend the timelines of biology to your will, even if your optimism suggests otherwise.
Can you walk me through the sunk cost fallacy, which you write in this edition? You've actually mentioned it, honestly, a handful of times on the podcast before, but can you give specific examples to those out there listening who don't know what it is? Maybe like running specific examples. This is actually a framework we used in 2023 when we were training for a marathon. My first marathon, you were coaching me, and we were kind of in a pickle where you write about a kill criteria in this edition, and that was something we ourselves used.
That's right. Yeah. So the sunk cost fallacy, to define it more broadly first, and then I'll go into running specific examples. It's when you continue investing time or effort into something because you've already committed time, energy, money, whatever, even if it's clear that stopping is clearly the better path. And so ultimately, we make our future selves prisoners of our past decisions because we struggle to reevaluate the costs and benefits and assess them objectively. And so many people are unwilling to quit until it's really no longer a choice. And oftentimes they need to wait for like extraordinary proof or catastrophic damage to say, hey, I need to switch paths here. But otherwise, like, I think we fail to stop short because like we're embarrassed of saying, hey, I gave up too soon, or I didn't try hard enough. But the desire to avoid temporary embarrassment often locks people into long-term misery, in my opinion. So like a lot of times when people are dealing with injuries, this is what we went through in 2023. They'll be getting very close to championship season, or they're going to be getting very close to a goal race. And they say to themselves, and something pops up. Let's just say they have an injury that's getting worse and worse by the day. But their mindset or what they're telling themselves is, I've come this far. I'm so fit. I can't stop now. Like, I need to express this fitness or else it will all be a waste. But what they're missing is like that also comes with a cost. They're waiting for like the catastrophic damage, the extraordinary proof that they need to stop. One example, just because I think it's very relevant, where this pops up too, is like summit fever when you're climbing a mountain. And the most extreme example of that would be Mount Everest, right? And so this was well documented in a book called Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, which documented the 1996 disaster that happened on the mountain, where so many times climbers will ignore their turnaround time, which is like the drop dead, like we're turning back no matter what, because they're really close to the summit. Think about what it takes to get to the top of Everest, the amount of training it takes, the amount of money you need to invest, the amount of days you've already spent in misery on the mountain. Nobody wants to turn around at 2 p.m. turnaround time if they're an hour away from the summit. But these turnaround times are calculated for your safety in mind. And it's basically like turn around or you will die. And I think very few people are able to make those hard decisions because they only look at what they've invested and they don't look at what they could potentially lose by continuing. And so just to wrap this up, Charles Hicks, who was just on the podcast and is someone who I coach, he had a great quote, which he told me the other day, several months ago, actually, where he said, "It never ceases to amaze me when an athlete is at a training hole, how often they reach for the shovel instead of the ladder." We never really like to, quote, like close our mental accounts in the red when we feel like we're suffering a loss. And we always think that harder work is going to right the ship and get us out of that hole. But more often than not, like that perspective is what causes us to miss the lifeline that's available. So I'll pause there. Any reflections? Otherwise, we can move towards kill criteria.
Yeah, take me through that.
Okay.
I don't want to drag this out because I could turn this position into a 60-minute podcast itself.
I know. That's a challenge. We try to make these newsletters dense and packed with wisdom for our audience. So it's a lot to get through. One way to counteract the sunk cost fallacy is to establish kill criteria, which are basically like predefined conditions that tell you, okay, I'm going to stop if this happens. Problem is, like in the heat of the moment, when you're emotional and like you're thinking about everything that you stand to lose when you're about to quit or when you're about to kind of like pivot, emotion is not a very reliable source of logic. And when ahead of time, like if you talk with your coach and you're like, okay, an example that I cite in the piece is, okay, if I'm feeling pain and I'm experiencing that something that's greater than 3 out of 10 on the pain scale for more than 3 days in a row, that's a good time to adjust training. But in the heat of the moment, you almost never do that. So if you come in with the predefined expectations of that's when I'm going to kill it, and that's what I'm going to switch, it's usually a little bit easier because the kill criteria shift your perspective from the questions the knee-jerk reaction, which is like, how much have I already invested and what am I going to lose, to instead saying, okay, if I were starting fresh today, would I continue, or what would someone else in my position do? So it's usually a pretty good way of thinking, okay, let me project into the future and say, if these things happen, it's time to modify, and you need to hold yourself to that in the moment.
I love it. Absolutely love it. One of your final points in this edition was think like a scientist. I really appreciated this as a close to this newsletter. Take the people through this and maybe an overall takeaway message from this edition of the newsletter.
Yeah, exactly. So this idea of think like a scientist came from Adam Grant, who wrote a book called Think Again. And he says that most people, the default modes of thinking put us into 3 or 4 different categories. The first is that you have the preacher, who he says will defend beliefs as sacred truths. You have the prosecutor, who's going to look only for flaws in the arguments of others, and the politician, who's going to bend ideas to win approval from others. And those 3 modes of thinking typically close us off from learning. But what he says, what we should all do, or he recommends, is to think like a scientist, because scientists, unlike the other professions, they treat beliefs not as ground truths, but as hypotheses to be tested. They will seek out disconfirming evidence. They don't just look for things that confirm what they've already found. And they'll update their views when the data shifts, and they'll iterate rather than clinging to that one predefined truth in the beginning. And so I think this is the mindset that ultimately will help us build humility, curiosity. It makes us absorb errors better. And I think ultimately it's very hard to like out muscle our blind spots, but we can learn to recognize them and approach these problems and these common issues with a scientist mindset, which is, let me be a little bit less certain and let me ask a few more questions and be a little bit more curious. So that would be the takeaway.
Always love a good analytical scientific newsletter, which is the next one. The myth of predictable progress. Training plans are linear. Human bodies aren't. Here's how to reconcile the two. Alex, how do we reconcile the two? Tell me.
Well, let me first set up the problem, which is if you were to pick an athlete or a coach off the street and they're just like in their preseason cross country meeting or they're at the beginning of a marathon build, no one in their right mind would ever think, oh, this is, I mean, unless you're extremely pessimistic, oh, like I'm not going to get better this season. You tend to construct like training plans and you have this idea that like, hey, everything is going to work out really, really well. I know I'm going to get better because of X, Y, and Z. Now, I think this is one of the biggest mismatches between expectation and reality that we find in the sport. Even the best coaches in the world, their athletes don't always reliably deliver when they need to in championship season because there's all sorts of things that get in the way. And this was really brought to a fine point when I read a study that surveyed over 100 endurance coaches that had years and years of experience. And they were asked, how often do you think you can predict how much an athlete will improve across a training block? And only 13%, let me say that again, 13% said that they could often predict how much an athlete was going to improve, which is kind of insane when you think about it. And so, you know, and I've been a part of these conversations. I'm the biggest culprit of this too. Like we look to authority, we look to our, you know, authoritative figures, our coaches, our mentors for reassurance and certainty. We want people to say, yes, you will get better. No one ever wants to admit the truth that like, hey, I don't know what's going to happen. We'll do the best that we can. You want certainty in those situations. You want a black and white answer. We talk about improvement so casually that we forget what we're implying, which is that performance gains are predictable and training adaptation happens like it happens on an assembly line where X input leads to Y output. But when you look at the science, that's increasingly at odds with what we're finding, and it's different from lived experience.
Please hold me to 30 seconds of rant here because I am going on a side tangent here. I notice relationships, business, running a podcast, running, sports. There's a common theme that the best people have that others don't. And it's in a romantic relationship, I call it the risk of love, and other things, I don't know what you would call it. But it is putting yourself on the line and knowing that you might not get the reward you're looking for at the end of the day. So for instance, I'll use a romantic relationship example. It's dating someone like you could be with them for the rest of your life. And so pouring your heart into it while risking the possibility that you could break up and never talk to them again. And running, it is training like you want to win a state championship with risking the reality that that very well might not be the case because these things are very elaborate and it's very hard to like quantify whether something will happen or not. And so as you talk there, I think that the hard thing is like giving yourself to a coach and saying, yeah, I have no clue what you're going to do with me, but that's the risk I'm willing to entail because I'm doing it for the love of the thing, right? I'm doing it for the love of the sport because I think I can. Anyways, I'll stop myself here because it's way over 30 seconds, but any thoughts for me off of that?
No, there's a great C.S. Lewis quote, which is, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure that you're keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully with hobbies, little luxuries, avoid all entanglements, lock it up safe in the casket of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broke. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. So the point is, like, if you've been broken by the sport once, or your heart's been broken in whatever context, so many people fear putting themselves back in it again because of the potential uncertainty. But the best people are like, I know the risk and I'm willing to do it anyway because I'll be better off if I tried. So that's a huge part of it. I totally agree.
I remember I was kind of in a controlled situation that freshmen in high school will never get, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. And I remember being like, F it. I have no races. I'm going to find the line in training. And if I get injured, I get injured. I don't care. And it was actually kind of a fun moment in time where I definitely was pushing the boundaries of what was probably reasonable at the time, but I was willing to accept the risks of potentially getting injured. And I went about a lot of things wrong in high school from a training perspective. But the one thing that I do look back and I do love was sometimes I did have the mentality of like, okay, this could work. And if so, great. And if not, yeah, I'll be crushed, but I know what I'm signing up for and I know the risks. And that's what you do anytime you line up for a race, or at least I think that's a good mindset to have, is like, I know my upside and I know my downside, but what can I control? It's my effort. And I'm just going to go in like I think I can do everything I can, but okay if that's not the case, and I'm not going to beat myself up. I saw a really cool reflection Instagram reel from Berlin Marathon, and this guy was like pissed. He was like, I'm seeing everyone in their like Instagram recap posts like bitch and moan about how hot the weather was and how they didn't hit their PR and he's like, we have lost as a society the value of running 42K. He's like, it's crazy to run 26.2 miles. He's like, we have become a society that like only values doing things your body has never done before, that even in a crazy variable where, Alex, I think the race got up to like 85 degrees, people are unwilling to accept the fact that it is objectively still impressive that they ran X, Y, or Z time or even finished the race in and of itself. And that's where I don't know what the takeaway is for a listener, but like if you're in a situation or scenario, let's say you got a really bad night of sleep before your race, or you had a really stressful test the night before or situation with your family, but you did the best that you could, but it wasn't like your A goal that you would have hit if everything was like totally fine. Be happy with that. Be content with that. And an issue I see that I myself experience, people just find it so hard to be proud of themselves when they don't do like the 1% of the craziest things possible. And anything below that, they can't feel proud of themselves, which I think is concerning.
No, exactly. I mean, and high performance have a tendency to, if they did, 9 things well, but one thing wrong, they're going to fixate on the one thing they did wrong. And a lot of coaching that I've learned is like learning to like teach people, or at least pointing out places where they can and should give themselves credit for doing things well. So completely agree with that point.
Going back into the newsletter itself, one of the sections I loved the most was the hidden variable U. Take me through this section.
Exactly. So, I think a lot of times when we look at sports science, people will look for like, can I test a training model and see how much people improve? And so typically you'll take like 20 to 60 people, you'll run them through a training intervention, and you'll say like, what's better, double threshold or like, high intensity training? And you'll compare the mean effect from both of those groups. And so typically what you'll find is all training programs to some degree, if you zoom out far enough, are going to give you an improvement. Usually, let's just say somewhere between like 3 and 6%. That's usually how much you can have someone improve within a matter of weeks if you take them off the couch or you take relatively active people. The challenge and kind of the central thesis of part of this newsletter is that when you actually zoom in, you start to see a more interesting story unfold, which is that there's a huge amount of individual variability within that actual mean improvement. You have some people that might actually be regressing. They might get 3% worse. And you have the majority of people who might be 1 to 5% better. And then you have some people on the other side who are like a 10% improvement. And so, it's a humbling conclusion that like we tend to think of training as this very linear and predictable thing where we sequence all of these variables correctly. It's almost always base mileage to long reps to sharpening reps to like race pace specific. And, we tend to deduce the optimal strategy from what's familiar to us. That's a playbook that almost every coach is going to pull out. But I think if you never challenge the assumptions, you may risk mistaking tradition for truth. And I think the challenge here is if you actually look at the science, what tends to matter more than the sequencing of the variables or the overall program is actually the individual responding to it. And so what I write about here is why is that? Why is it that you have this huge spectrum of outcomes with somebody who's doing a training program? You're literally standardizing everything. You're having them eat the same thing. You're having them, to the extent that it's possible, you're trying to have them work out at the same time of day. You're giving them the same training stimulus and the same training zones, but you're getting this huge outcome. And I would say that biological systems just aren't that predictable because every training stimulus that is applied to the body has to pass through an individual set of filters before adaptation occurs. This was something that I pulled from a paper called Periodization Theory, Confronting an Inconvenient Truth, written by John Kiley in 2018. And he says that these filters are always going to shape whether the training helps, it hurts, or it has no effect. And they always determine the magnitude. So some of those filters, just to bring this into real life examples, are like genetics. Some people have genetic predispositions to respond really, really well to like aerobic volume. Some people, because of their muscle fiber typology, might respond really, really well to like sprint intervals, for instance. Training history is another one. What you've done in the past is going to inform how you predict, how you adapt to things in the future. What you're eating, nutritional status, huge lever that you can pull in training adaptation. Others are more subtle, right? Like how mentally stressed are you? What's your social support system like? What's your emotional state? And so all of a sudden you get this dizzying array of variables where you're like, oh my gosh, like training is not just as simple as input, output. The dose of training is not necessarily what's written on the page by the coach, but it's what survives after passing through that web of modifiers. And I write that like this, the especially one thing that people should consider is that the psychological and the emotional backdrop of your life is the canvas upon which you're painting the training stimulus. And so I think that's such an important point that is often neglected. And that's one of the things that explains why we're so bad at predicting improvement.
One of my favorite lines is towards the very bottom. You say, if two athletes follow the same plan and end up in different places, it's not because one failed, it's because training doesn't happen in a vacuum. Can you elaborate on that specific point to close out this edition?
Exactly. I think a lot of coaches will coach from the model down rather than the athlete's individual profile up. In other words, everyone has their playbook in their back pocket that they rely on. There's a lot of, and I do it myself, there's a lot of autobiographical coaching. You know, like I'm an individual who responded really, really well to this in college. Therefore, I assume this will work for this athlete or that athlete. But the reality is that we're all our own experiments that are unfolding in real time, and it's messy and it's uncontrolled. And so I think a big thing, again, like you have to challenge conventions. You have to make sure that you're not just taking the optimal strategy the familiar strategy and assuming it's optimal. You need to question what is best for this individual. If someone isn't responding, or you're kind of like, you're feeling like you're stagnating, like sometimes it's not about trying harder in the same model. Sometimes it's about trying differently. And the improvement is a lot of times shaped by those thousands of small different forces. And there's some big levers you can pull and there's some small levers you can pull. As an athlete, focus on the things that you can do to make sure you maximize the training stimulus, which is you're sleeping well, you're not too mentally stressed, you're fueling well, and then you're doing all kind of the supplementary things that matter. And then as a coach, I think it's a matter of questioning like, okay, if we have demonstrated evidence that an athlete hasn't responded to this method or that method, let's tweak it slightly. Let's see if maybe they're a little bit more anaerobically dominant, and we're going to try a couple different workout types, and we're going to see if that kind of makes a difference. So I don't think we're ever going to be able to eliminate the uncertainty of being able to predict performance perfectly, but I think we have to work with it. And the biggest thing is, rather than approaching training from a prescriptive standpoint, where the whole plan is written before the season even starts, what's way more important, in my opinion, is being responsive to changes as they come up along the way.
On the line of training and how to properly write training, some of the things and situations to be aware of, the next edition you wrote on was expect the unexpected. A training plan is only useful if it can survive reality. Alex, you start this piece by talking about the start of a new season, the infinite possibilities. You talk about, where the races are circled and the key workouts and the perfect 65-degree mornings for workouts and all this stuff. And then I loved reading it when we were editing it, and you just go, but this vision is a lie. In my fantasy, nobody gets sick. No one pulls out mid-workout with a sore shin. There are no family emergencies, no surprise heat waves. Everything unfolds exactly as planned. The 4 things you mentioned there, I don't know if I went through a season without experiencing like 2 or 3 of those. Take me through, expect the unexpected. How do, if you're an athlete, deal with that? If you're a coach with that.
Yeah, exactly. So the plan never works, right? Like reality always has a way of triumphing over the most elegant training plans. We've spoken about this before. And of course, it's not in human nature to assume that the path is going to be turbulent. When we project forward into the future, we assume that we're going to have a linear progression and that everything is going to go really well, as I just talked about a minute ago. There's a great quote, which is that it is in human nature that when the sea is calm, we forget to think about storms, right? Like chaos rarely is going to politely knock on your door. You're going to have periods of general stability, and then you're just going to have these punctuated moments of just like massive instability. And you have no idea when those things are going to come around. And so going back to the study I just mentioned, one other thing they asked these coaches, again, this was over 100 coaches who specialize in endurance training. They said, how often do they adjust their plans based on ongoing athlete feedback? And it turns out that almost half of them either always or often adjusted the plan. which just like flies in the face of what we assume, which is like, okay, I have this really nice system. I have all of these like workouts that I have planned on these days. And like the reality is almost no coach ever goes through with that plan in its entirety. I'm just going to read one brief piece from the newsletter, and then I'm going to hand the mic back over to you just because I like this idea a lot. I said, again, making changes is not a flaw. It's a feature of effective coaching. Every past season is the sum of course corrections. Every future season will rely more on real-time responsiveness than rigid plans. And yet, we keep trying to forecast the future as a predictable entity. We build plans that assume smooth progressions, then treat deviations as failures rather than reality. Every program is threatened by risks that lie dormant. It's very hard to engineer those risks out of the plan because risk, by definition, is what you don't see coming. If you could map it out, you could avoid it, but you cannot predict the things that are going to surprise you. And Ray Dalio has a quote. He puts it bluntly. He says, "Those who live by the crystal ball will die eating shattered glass." In other words, stop trying to predict the future. Build a flexible plan. Build one that can be responsive to feedback. You have to build plans that can bend before they break. That is the name of the game.
So many thoughts for you off of this, but you know me, Alex, I like to gatekeep some of the information so people actually go to the newsletter and we're not just reading the newsletter verbatim for the podcast listener. You guys listening out there, you have to do some work. You have to go in the show notes. You got to read these pieces. They're excellent. They'll help you out. So I want to ask you a question that isn't in this newsletter. What's an example of your career where something unexpected happened and a coach pivoted, and in hindsight, you look back on that experience and think it made you a better athlete and you were way more valued, and the result was way better for you by adjusting the plan rather than saying like, oh, screw it, I'm just going to do what was planned anyways?
So yeah, great question. And when you say that, it takes me back to when I was a junior at Stanford. I had kind of had my breakout cross country season. The preseason meets were going really, really well. My summer of training was fantastic. And we were well positioned to not only make the national meet, but be on the podium and maybe even have a shot to win. I remember that towards the end of the season, almost every college athlete is going to do the same sequence of races before nationals. It's going to be your conference meet, which is usually the weekend of Halloween. Then you're going to have the regional meet 2 weeks later, and then you're going to have the national meet a week after that. And the regional meet's tricky because you have to run well enough there to bring your team to nationals, but like you don't want to fire too many bullets because literally 8 days later you will race nationals, and a hard 10K can take a lot out of you. And so I remember after conference my junior year, I had no experience running the entirety of a cross country season in college because I hadn't been healthy yet the whole time up until then. I'd run races here and there, but never a full season. And I remember I was starting to get a little bit tired, like after the conference meet. Like the training was building up, the season was just like becoming a little bit fatiguing, a lot of travel, as you can imagine. And I remember Coach Milt pulling me aside and saying, "Hey, like based on what I'm seeing right now, like I don't think we should run you at the regional meet." And I was like, "What?" Like the regional meet is like, we need to run well there to make it to nationals. And like, that was always a part of the plan. Like, why would we not do that? And maybe I wasn't that shocked at the time. I probably listened to him and was a rule abiding member of the team. But regardless, I think internally that shook me a little bit because that was always a part of the kind of how I had envisioned the last 3 weeks of the season going. And so, true to his word, he actually held me out of regionals, and I did a workout. I avoided the travel trip. I did a workout instead. And, I was 16th at cross country nationals in my first NCAA championship in college 3 weeks later. Now I cannot run the counterfactual. I don't know what would have happened had I actually run regionals and like burned a match and fired a bullet there. But I think that the willingness to like assess the situation, look for a time when, hey, maybe like, the original plan we had written wasn't perfect for the scenario that had unfolded. Like, let's be willing to deviate from the plan here. And I think ultimately that led to me having a very successful finish at nationals.
Closing this one out, you close it out with a section called Become a Better Reactor. You quote Coach K from the school we can't mention across the pond or whatever you have in North Carolina. He coached at Duke for many years and was one of the greatest coaches of all time. He said, quote, I'm not a world-class predictor. I'm a world-class reactor. You go on to say, my takeaway message is this: instead of trying to predict the future, focus on responding to what reality presents. Iterate on the original plan, build a margin for error, and remember, chaos will arrive at some point. Your job is to be ready for it. I guess a closing question for you in reflection is, you mentioned the training side of things, how you mentioned stats, you give me examples of things in a training calendar and a training year that will inevitably pop up and force you to be a reactor. I also think, though, as I read that quote, my day-to-day life, I can sketch out the night before and just inevitably something happens. Someone calls me who needs me. Happened a few weeks ago. Someone hacked into my Gmail account, and then you spend an hour trying to recover it and being stressed. You see something off on your credit card statement. A friend calls you who needs you and you want to be present for them. And suddenly this meticulously every 15-minute planned day kind of goes to shit. Pardon my French. My question for you is, how can people become a better reactor, not just in their running and their training and their racing, but also in their everyday lives? Because I imagine other people relate in that it's so hard. Unless you live in a cabin in the woods, your day is going to be interrupted and you're going to have to choose to react in a good way.
Yeah, 100%. I'll pull it back to something I mentioned in the newsletter here, which was pretty transformative for me, because I have, and I'm sure a lot of people listening have had that exact same experience. I think you have to leave margin for error. And let me give you an example, right? Like, if you're an engineer building a bridge, you don't build the bridge to carry only the expected load. You include a safety margin that can account for unforeseen circumstances like heavy traffic, like hurricane force winds, and structural decay over time. And I think in the same way, if you design your life or you design a training plan to only handle the expected challenges, it's going to fail as soon as something unexpected arises. And so I think the more rigid your plan is, the more fragile you ultimately become, because the list of things that could happen is like infinitely longer than the number of things that you can prepare for. So it's not about predicting every scenario that could unfold and trying to script the perfect solution for it. I think it's about discarding and throwing out the idea of a perfect forecast, and instead investing in your ability to absorb disruption gracefully. One way that I do that in training, when I think about this, is be willing to like leave some space for like things that could go wrong. And I think a good way to do that is like have a rest day in the calendar that you can flex if needed. Like, I don't think resting every Sunday is a relatively arbitrary convention. I don't think there's anything special about that. One of the athletes that I coach, Kaylee Mitchell, just like before USA's was like feeling kind of run down and wanted to recover. And she took a rest day on a Friday, and she was like, it felt like sacrilegious to do that. And I was like, yeah, that means there's nothing wrong with taking a rest day on a Friday if you need it. Again, don't be prescriptive, be responsive. Cross training a little bit to give yourself a little bit, like, don't try to max out the volume every single week, like leave a little bit of buffer for cross training. And then a down week, like you don't always need the down week in the moment, but investing in the down week when you lower your mileage by 25, 30% or whatever, it probably increases your capacity to be resilient and absorb more hits later on, because you're not always on the razor's edge. So I think those are just a couple of thoughts that come to mind.
I have up on my phone, Make the Bad Days Count, the last edition. We're going to recap, but I do actually want to go back to something that I remember you wrote about in this piece. I learned about it from a man named Ethan Strand, and this was Ethan Strand before he was Ethan Strand. And one of the best principles he taught me in our early conversations before he became Ethan Strand was this frame that Milt taught him, which was the next logical step. I was asking him about his future and goals. And again, this was before he did anything crazy. And instead of saying things like make the world championships or, win an NCAA title, he said, I just need the next logical step. And the next logical step for me is, I forget what he said, but essentially this framework of, what is the next logical step for you? Because people have these crazy, ridiculous, big dreams and goals. And for him, I think at the time it would have been winning an NCAA title, but he wasn't quite there. And he knew that by taking the next logical step after that would have been winning an NCAA title. But if he only focused on the NCAA title, he probably wouldn't have made much progress at all. So in short, what's your thought on the concept of the next logical step and how people can apply it into their training?
Yeah, I think a lot of people try to map out every step and turn before they begin. And there's just a certain element of like, know where you need to go next, be willing to start walking on that path, and trust that the path will emerge as you go. There's a guy named Thomas Carlyle who once said that the task of man is not to see what lies dimly in the distance, but to do what lies clearly at hand. And there's a framework that I learned from Milt as well. And I think he took it from a podcast at some point in time. I can't attribute it to its original source, but that's okay. It's called the ABZ framework. And so this just makes it very simple to conceptualize. And it says, like, what matters is knowing where you are now, which is point A, where you ultimately want to go, point Z. So maybe for Ethan, that's to be an Olympian, right? Those are things that are so far in the future that it's not even really practical or realistic or actionable to think about them too much today. You just want to put that on the shelf for a little bit. But what does matter is the next step that will move you a little bit closer to that goal, which is step B. So again, know where you are at point A, know where you want to get at point Z, and then focus on getting from A to B. The rest, so that would be steps C through Y, are going to reveal themselves as you go along, and you have to trust in that. Have you ever heard of, there's one thing I wanted to bring up. Have you ever heard of the tower experiment where they had kindergartners and MBA students try to build a tower out of spaghetti?
No.
Okay. I'm just going to bring this up because I think it kind of like...
The research had too much fun with it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. I'll bring this up because I think it reinforces this point from a slightly different angle. They did a study where they got a bunch of MBA students and kindergartners together, and they gave them 20 strands of uncooked spaghetti, a yard of string, a yard of tape, and one marshmallow. And they said, build the tallest freestanding structure that you can in 18 minutes. And you have to put the marshmallow on the top. And who do you think actually outperformed the other group?
I'm going to say the kindergartners, otherwise we would not be bringing up this study.
Yes, that's correct. So the kindergartners shockingly beat the MBA students. And I think it underscores a powerful principle, which is that, like, kindergartners just like start trying things. They don't intellectually debate how they're going to build the tower. They just take what they have at hand and they're like, I'm going to just start building and prototyping. And I think the idea here, the take home message is like, talk less and prototype more, because ultimately you will learn way more in like 10 minutes of prototyping and building than you will from like 10 hours of intellectual debate. So I think it just goes to show, like, again, take that next step forward and know where you need to go at point B and focus really on nothing else.
Make the bad days count. The secret to progress lies in your worst days. Final thing we're going to recap today, final edition. Take me through why you believe that the secret to most people's progress lies in their worst days.
Yeah, so I think Coach Milt always used to say in college, dream the right dream. There's a tendency we have when we picture the future. I brought this up multiple times today, that, you know, at the championship race, we're going to be shoulder to shoulder with our teammates. The sun's going to be shining. Our parents are going to be at the finish line ready to give us a hug. And like, you're just feeling great. You've got 10 more gears in your back pocket. Never happens, right? Like, we never picture this scenario where like things aren't going really well, where like you're getting dropped halfway through the race. And like, I think so many times we treat those things, like, both in the big moments in races and in practice, we treat them as throwaway moments because we always want to be like having the day where like everything's clicking and everything's going really, really well. Problem is that anyone can shine when they're feeling really good, but that's not where the margin of separation happens. The difference between good and great athletes, I think, is decided on days when they don't click. So if you think about training, if it happens on like a 1 to 10 scale, 1 being the worst day you have and 10 being the best day that you have, most sessions are going to live in that middle zone between like a 4 and a 6. And so occasionally you might get like an 8, 9, or a 10 where everything feels really, really good. And inevitably you're going to have some bad days where you're like a 1, 2, or a 3 on the scale. And the temptation that most people has is to obsess over the 9s and 10s, to try to get those every single time. But that's like trying to catch lightning in a bottle. It's just not going to happen. You can't manufacture that. You can't produce those at will. What you can influence, and I think what is way more important, is if you can turn a miserable 2 into a serviceable 4, which is what I write. And I think so many times we focus on raising the ceiling, but we forget about raising the floor. So instead of making our best days better, can you also make your really bad days a little less bad? And so shifting that floor up is one way to improve that a lot of people forget about. And the ceiling can really only be built higher over time if the foundation beneath it also rises. So that's kind of the premise for this piece.
I believe you shared this with me a while ago, probably on a phone call as we were diving into the complexities of the running world. Correct me if I'm wrong if this wasn't you, but I believe it was you. You were telling me about Grant in college and also Grant as a professional. But I think you were talking about his college days, how even on his worst days, you guys knew that you could reliably put him in this, like, he would place between this and this. And the margin of that versus like the average NCAA runner was so much smaller than the average NCAA runner. And you were basically saying the importance of like the quality of the top people is their worst days are like recognizable to them, but like so unrecognizable to other people. Where like Kipchoge, his bad marathons, most people wouldn't notice it was a bad day for him because the margin between his worst day and his best day isn't that far off, versus the average Joe listening. The difference between their worst day is crying on the bus home and their best day is like elation and celebration. I'm not sure how much of that kind of mixture you write about in this piece. I don't know if there's anything to connect to in that, but any reflections from that thing you told me probably even years ago at this point?
I'm sure I mentioned it because that was kind of a major theme of who we tried to be as a team. And obviously Grant exemplified that really, really well. He did win one NCAA title, but like he also was never worse than like, I don't know, like probably fifth on the track, including indoors and outdoors. And I think he was 17th as a freshman for cross country, and it was never worse than that. I think he was 17th, fifth, and second. And so it's a great point, and I'll just repeat what you said back to you in slightly different words, which is that I think really good athletes focus on having a contained range of outcomes. Like the margin between their best day and their worst day is like almost impossible for an outsider to discern. They may know, as you said, like, hey, I was really, really good, or I was not great right now, but like they're able to they're able to raise that floor up so high such that like there's a very, very small deviation between when they're at their best and when they're at their worst. And I think that's one thing that athletes at all levels can focus on. And one nice kind of mental trick that you can think about, which I heard before, is so many people define themselves by their single best race, by their PRs in every event. Another way to think about that is, and ultimately what that does is like perfect races are hard to come by. You need potentially pacemakers, you need good weather conditions, you need to have had good training leading into it. Like those are fleeting moments. And like you can't bet on that happening every time you show up to race. It's just statistically not possible. But instead of defining yourself only by your best race, what if you defined yourself by the average of your 5 best races? So if it's a foregone conclusion, maybe you can't PR today because you got 20-mile-an-hour winds. Well, how about this? Like, let's say your mile PRs are like 432, 436, like 440, 442, and like 502. Let's try to like knock that 502 off and like let's try to raise that average up a little bit higher. I think it keeps you fighting for something that otherwise you would just give up on when perfection slips away, because ultimately perfection's always going to slip away. So again, for those out here who are racing, focus on a contained range of outcomes. And one way to think about that is don't just try to move up your single best performance, but always be aiming to increase the average of your 5 best.
You kind of write on that in this piece, talking about focus less on the peak, more on the average. You close out that section by saying the same logic applies in training. Hero sessions don't build careers, consistent sessions do. If you raise the floor, if you average days become a little better, you create sustainable compounding progress. Off of that point, the next section after that I really appreciated was excellent is a discipline, not a moment. Really liked this because it's a very short section, but I think there's a lot of wisdom that can be reflected on if you read it or you listen to what Alex is about to say as the listener. Elaborate on that kind of framework, because I think a lot of people think excellence is just a moment that happens in time, but not a discipline.
Yeah, exactly. So excellence is built on a lot of ordinary days. Shalane Flanagan, who coaches at Oregon, and I coach with her now for the pros who are out here in Eugene, she has a quote where she says something along the lines of, it is on an I always remind myself that on an ordinary day, I'm preparing myself for the extraordinary. I think so many people are waiting to just like get to race day so they can like turn their brain on, like hype themselves up, put themselves in a totally different frame of mind. And they forget that like, no, like your best effort isn't just about like one heroic day. It's a mentality, and it's a collection of habits that are forged on the hundreds of ordinary days when you could have cut corners, but you didn't. You continue to show up when it would have been easier to skip. Like it's about when you could have rushed through the fundamental drills, but you actually were intentional about them. All of excellence is grounded in small, forgettable details. And the best athletes never forget that. They're not sexy. They don't look like much, but they're the scaffolding that makes the extraordinary days possible.
You may or may not cover this in the newsletter. I don't have the edition on me at this very second. I don't want to pull my phone out to try and see if you did. So pardon me here, but I think a good question. And again, trying to find questions that maybe are separate from the newsletter to gatekeep a little bit so people go read them. What are ways, as a takeaway question from this edition, what are ways that people can make their bad days better? I'm actually remembering something you write in this newsletter is essentially like raising the floor, and a saying my parents brought me up on, which I actually, not to, overly pat my parents on the back, but a saying they had growing up that I love and I want to take into parenthood one day is they would always say, we want our ceiling to be your floor, which I love that. So for you, how can people raise their floor, aka how can people make their bad days better?
Yeah, I mean, we stand on the shoulders of giants is a quote that I will oftentimes use. I think a lot of times it's about Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger, one of the two of them said, like, compounding is like the eighth wonder of the world, right? And the most important thing about compounding is that you should never interrupt it unnecessarily. And so I think there are days when you actually need to rest. And I don't want to make it sound heroic to like train through the flu or when you're sick, because that's actually more detrimental than it is productive. But there are a lot of days when you aren't going to feel great, when like you need to put a number on the board. Like, again, you need to put out an effort that's serviceable. And I think a lot of times we're so obsessed with the optimal that we forget about like just like putting forth sufficient effort. And so I think if you have those days where like you're not feeling great, whatever you need to tell yourself, like just to get through it, whether it's just like go one more or like don't put a 0 on the board, remember that effort isn't wasted. It doesn't need to be incredible, but like there's a lot to be said for like keeping the chain going and like not letting it break unnecessarily. And again, this is not about the days when like you have COVID, you should rest, but it's about the days when like you maybe don't feel like it. The reality is, like, I quote another thing that says the heaviest weight in the gym is always the front door. Like starting a difficult activity is always harder than continuing it. So just get started and see where it goes, because oftentimes you don't need to feel good to get going. You just need to get going to feel good.
Love it. So good. Final thought for you. I'll let you reply and then we'll close this one as we're up on time. It's on those days that you prove to yourself or you find out to yourself about the type of person you are. It's really easy to run when you feel like it. It's really easy to run when it's a cool October morning and you can wear a long sleeve and tights and you can breathe full amounts of oxygen and enjoy the scenery of the fall foliage. How do you say it? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Tongue twister. What's really hard is a summer day when your legs are heavy and tired and it's ridiculously humid and ridiculously hot, or it's really hard to get your gym session in when it's planned, but you had a full day with other activities. And and you could elaborate on a million examples, right? I just gave you 2. Those are the days where you figure out who you actually are, because those are the days that the qualities you say you want to have or you say you have are actually tested. It's really easy to say you're brave. It's really easy to say you're disciplined. It's really easy to say you're a hard worker. It's another thing to prove those things to yourself when they're actually tested.
Yeah. I'll just respond and we can close it out. I think that, motivation is perishable. It comes and it goes. Discipline is kind of the bedrock of consistency that keeps you going. And James Clear has this great idea that every action you take is you casting a vote for the type of person that you want to become. Personalities are malleable. Like who we ultimately become are totally up to our discretion. We can make those choices on a day-to-day basis. So if you choose the hard thing and you're consistently leaning into discomfort, you're consistently doing things that challenge you, the person that you're going to be on the other side of that is fundamentally different than the person who just gives up when things start to get slightly difficult. So remember that you play an active role in shaping who you ultimately become in those difficult and challenging moments.
I love it. Again, to the people listening, if you enjoyed this conversation with Alex, I can guarantee you will enjoy and find value from his writings and insights and wisdom, which come out every single Thursday in your inbox. I've left a link in the show notes. First link, click on it, subscribe for free. If you don't love it, unsubscribe, DM me. It's still not happened yet. You're not going to unsubscribe. So take this as a bet to prove me wrong. You're going to subscribe. You're going to love it. I'm calling it. Final question for you, Alex. We're deep, we're insightful, we're philosophical. Let's bring it back human to human. It's fall season. What's the favorite Alex Ostberg fall item? It could be a pumpkin spice latte, could be seeing pumpkins on people's doorsteps, could be a movie. What's the Alex Osberg fall essential?
You mentioned it already. It's I love when the grocery stores get transformed to have pumpkin flavored everything. It's like my favorite flavor, and the fact that it's so short lasting and you only get to enjoy it for like 1 month of the year makes me like look forward to it that much more. So I am very much enjoying like walking down the aisles these days with my grocery cart and popping in whatever pumpkin spice items that I can find. It's simple pleasures in life, you know.
Other important question, not to send the paparazzi off at you, but this is an interesting question. I love asking people, what's the grocery store of choice? I don't know what they have in Eugene, but
Yeah. It's either Albertsons is a common one or Whole Foods. But I've lived all over the country. I've shopped at like so many different kinds. It was in North Carolina, it was Harris Teeter, Trader Joe's. Here it's sometimes Trader Joe's. Safeway was a big one in California. But right now it's Albertsons and Whole Foods. Those are the two. And I go to each one for different reasons.
I'm becoming a Whole Foods pilled, and I do quite love it. I don't know if I love the total amount
I know.
when I get to the end of the aisle, but we have this thing in Ohio called Kroger. I think a lot of the Midwest does, and I mean, grocery prices I feel like are just ridiculous these days. But I got to the point where I was like, I feel like a boss with the other moms who drive their Range Rovers when I'm in Whole Foods, and I don't feel like a boss when I'm in Kroger, and the price is basically the same. So I've started to go to Whole Foods more. So anyways, besides the point, but the important questions at the end, where do you shop for groceries? Alex, thank you for your time. Appreciate you, man. And I'll catch you here soon, breaking out 4 more editions.
Pleasure as always.